Testing, testing.
Well, good afternoon. Thanks for being here in a lovely basement windowless room in the basement of the Capitol on a rainy day. This is the 10th anniversary of the passage of the Jobs Act. And so let me welcome you. I'm Patrick Mccarran. I'm the ranking member of the House Financial Services Committee. Before you, we have a great panel to talk about the history of how the Jobs Act came to be, the results of the Jobs Act. Many of you in the audience were participants in making it happen, but the panel before us had a special role in that. And then the look ahead, what we can learn from this, as well as key takeaways on opportunities. So let me begin. It said that what's passed is prologue. So 10 years ago, the Jumpstart Our Business Startups or Jobs Act was signed into law by President Obama in a Rose Garden signing ceremony. It was a special moment. It was in a broken Washington, a partisan Washington. No major legislation had been signed into law under a divided government. Democrats and Republicans were learning to, or actually relearning, the challenges and opportunities of divided government. The Jobs Act was born out of economic necessity, but it was out of three separate work streams that the ideas took form. The President's IPO task force, the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness, and the House Financial Service Committee members, and be as one of them. An opportunity emerged in October of 2011 when the President's IPO task force published a report detailing troubling trends for smaller companies in our capital markets. The task force found that from 1996 to 2011, American capital markets witnessed a steep decline in the number of IPOs of what are now known as emerging growth companies. About the same time, the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness offered a number of proposals to boost growth. And finally, as I said, a number of us on the House Financial Services Committee were working on similar legislation in roughly the same arena at roughly the same time. And during the summer and fall of 2011, the bills that originated out of the House Financial Services Committee passed through the House with bipartisan majorities. These bills, some of those bills will be cobbled together into the Jobs Act of 2012. This landmark legislation reduced regulatory barriers and created new avenues within our securities laws to enable small companies and entrepreneurs to raise capital. And it was bipartisan. And it was the product of a Republican House, a Democrat Senate, and a Democrat White House. And many of the panelists today played critical roles in getting the Jobs Act across the finish line. Steve Case served as on the President's Council on Jobs and Competitiveness and lobbied the White House, House Democrats, House Republicans and Democrats, any and everywhere they may be, on the importance of supporting young companies and startups. Joel Trotter served on the IPO task force that was the genesis of the Jobs Act. Joel also helped draft Title I of what will become the Jobs Act. Kevin Laws led a grassroots coalition of entrepreneurs and was helpful in particular language in the bill. Rodney Sampson lobbied Democrats and Republicans about the need for reforming Reg A and creating a crowdfunding exemption. These panelists helped the bill become law, implemented SEC rulemakings under the law, and have used the provisions firsthand. Today is not a remembrance ceremony, but a chance to honor what was and what can be, to understand the benefits of a major bipartisan bill and the challenges to emulate it. Now, may I introduce actually the person who will be leading our panel, Martha Miller, Director of the Office of the Advocate for Small Business Capital Formation of the Securities Exchange Commission. Look forward to her leading the discussion in the panel today. Martha?
Thank you very much, Mr. McHenry. I appreciate it. Looking forward to today's event, and with the lovely introduction that I'm from the SEC, many of you are fully expecting I'm going to give the lawyerly disclaimer, which means I'm speaking for myself, not the entirety of our agency. The same will apply for Commissioner Peirce, and we'll go ahead and wrap that around everyone sitting here, that whatever your hat that you wear, wherever you are employed, you don't necessarily speak for the entirety of that organization today. You get to speak as yourselves. I'm thrilled to be here today and to get to talk about the Jobs Act. We're going to have a little bit of a remembrance event, but it's going to be a positive celebration and then switching into looking prospectively at things that may need to change and evolve as we look ahead at the future, because I think that's what excites people who are in the room today. What I'd love to do before we kick off is to ask each of our panelists to give a quick, maybe 30-second introduction of who you are. What is the organization that you are not speaking on behalf of today? And then what was your role in the Jobs Act, or how do you interact with that now? And then from there, we're going to jump into looking back at the genesis of the Jobs Act, and then the most exciting part of the event, looking ahead at potential policy areas for improvement. So if it works, we'll start down at the end with Kevin and have you kick us off, and then we'll move our way down the table.
Great, thank you. I'm Kevin Laws. I was COO and then CEO of AngelList. It's a company that helps very small startups get access to capital, and it is now split into several companies, but among them are AngelList Venture that still does it, and Republic, which is one of the larger crowdfunding platforms.
Good afternoon, Rodney Sampson. I serve as Executive Chairman and CEO of Opportunity Hub. We are a suite of companies, a foundation, and actually an investment fund focused on creating racial equity in the tech, startup, and venture ecosystem, fourth industrial revolution, and beyond. I got involved with the Jobs Act via David Will IV, former Vice Chairman of NASDAQ, who introduced me to Woody and Jason. And I was learning about this new movement around capital formation and its promise for democratization. I said, well, maybe I could bring a little emancipation to the conversation. And so Kim Wells and Jervis Huff were actually a few of the Black people at the table during that time. And we worked on both sides of the aisle. It was kind of the tea party and the coffee party coming together. And that's how we got this across the way.
I'm Steve Case, and I have an investment firm called Revolution that has a particular focus on backing entrepreneurs outside of Silicon Valley, all around the country. We've made investments now in 200 companies in 100 cities, 36 states. So that's a big focus. But in terms of the Jobs Act, I was asked to co-chair something called the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship. That led to being asked to chair a White House initiative called Startup America, which then led to being asked to be on President Obama's Jobs Council, where I chaired the subcommittee around innovation and entrepreneurship. So that kind of led to the work on the Jobs Act.
I'm Hester Peirce. I was on the Hill in the Senate during the time that Jobs Act was being bandied about, but I'm now at the Securities and Exchange Commission, and I feel like my organization is the reason why we have the Jobs Act, because the SEC could have done a lot of these things on its own and decided not to, so Congress had to step in and do them.
I'm Joel Trotter. I'm a partner at Latham & Watkins. I practice securities law here in town. In terms of why I'm here, thank you for the invitation, Ranking Member McHenry. I was involved in the IPO task force thanks to a woman by the name of Kate Mitchell, who really started all of this after a Treasury Department meeting led by Mary Miller there in the audience and Secretary Geithner, which really got the IPO task force off the ground. Kate called me one afternoon and asked if I'd be interested. We talked for an hour. I didn't send her a bill. And she later told me, she hung up the phone and said, this guy is maybe crazy enough like myself to think that we can do something here. So Kate and I spent the summer writing the task force report with a lot of input from a large team. And then she and I literally walked the halls of Congress. We had an elevator pitch. We had a longer pitch. It was like we were in fundraising mode. We sat down in offices, and actually I first met Commissioner Peirce here on the Hill, briefing her as a member of the Senate Banking Committee staff, along with a fellow by the name of Mike Pivovar. And they both went on to bigger and better things, but that's the beginning of my involvement, and it's been a wild ride. It's certainly a great experience, and I'm looking forward to this panel.
My name is Jonathan Cohen. I'm president and CEO of 2020 Gene Systems in Gaithersburg, Maryland. We are an innovative lab testing company. We've done historically focused on early cancer detection. We've done over 250,000 COVID tests for residents of Montgomery County, Maryland, and are expanding it to a variety of other disease areas. I am both a beneficiary of and somewhat of an evangelist for equity crowdfunding, both Reg A and Reg CF. Our company's raised over $10 million to date from those mechanisms, and I have introduced this type of fundraising to probably about a half a dozen life science companies, which were a little slow to embrace this equity crowdfunding, but are making up for lost time. And I just want to take the opportunity to thank Representative McHenry and all of those in the room that worked so hard to get the Jobs Act across the finish line, and all of the implementing regulations, because I believe it's been a fantastic benefit to companies like us and hundreds of others.
Excellent. Well, as you can see, we've got a great group of people here. And one of the things we like to joke about in our office is it's very hard to find someone now who doesn't have a story about how they were involved in the Jobs Act. These are the real deal folks. But as you know, there are plenty of people around DC who've seen the successes of the Jobs Act, and they have a story about how they touched it. But they're sometimes shady on the details, because it's just very important to be the barnacle attaching yourself to this very popular ship. Treating this like it is season 2 of a TV show. Joel, can you do what would be the beginning recap and just give us the preview? You've talked a little bit about the task force and that beautiful 42-page report with plenty of insights that are in there. Can you just give us the recap for those who have not read it in a little while? I happen to have reread it last night, so it's fresh in my mind. What were some of the recommendations and ideas that task force put out that ultimately influenced what became Title I of the Jobs Act?
Sure, happy to talk about that. I've some of you have heard me talk about this topic before, and it's like you can pull the string on my back. We started off looking at the precipitous fall off of IPO activity in the decade prior to 2011 when we were looking at this. And actually the germ of the idea that really began the report was something that Kate Mitchell said at that Treasury Department meeting. And at the end of that, she was asked, what one thing do we need to do to bring back our IPO activity? And she said installation of issues that need to be readjusted, recalibrated to strike the right balance and make it more hospitable to do a public offering. And she was told, maybe by Mary, great, go do it. It's now the Mitchell Task Force. And so she assembled a group of us. So the idea was based on the following. If you have an early stage company that has taken investment capital from early stage investors, there are really two alternatives for returning capital to those early stage investors. You can either sell your company to a buyer, company sale, an M&A process, or you can go public. And those are really your only two alternatives. It's one or the other. And in the decade leading up to 2011, there was a pretty significant fall off of IPO activity, which tilted the balance dramatically toward M&A and away from the public markets. Why is that a bad thing? Kate and I would say, walking these halls, imagine what Seattle would look like today. Now, this was a different time, but in 2011, we were saying, imagine what Seattle would look like today if Microsoft had been bought by IBM instead of going public and becoming an independent public company. We assembled a lot of statistics or graphs, CEO surveys about the cost of going public. But the basic idea is, if you're faced with this choice as a company taking yourself to the next level and trying to monetize that early stage investment for those early investors, how do you do it? You're either going to do an M&A process or you're going to become a public company. And we thought the balance had tilted too far toward M&A and that it was not sufficiently hospitable. Entering the public markets was not sufficiently hospitable or easy to do. So how could we rebalance that choice so that we weren't driving our most innovative companies into an M&A process. So we came to the process with that bias that public markets are a good thing. 90+% of job growth of growing companies happens after they become public. Whereas with M&A, you have synergies, aka layoffs, after a small company is absorbed by a larger one. So we were affirmatively pro-IPO, and we wanted to make the process easier to do. Does that touch all the bases?
That is an excellent overview. And just to give a lovely plug, that report is still out there on the internet. So go check it out if you wanted to do a deeper dive, but a fantastic background. I want to now fast forward and talk a little bit about the process of building the bipartisan support that ultimately made it where the Jobs Act passed and was a success, and where now everybody of every stripe seems to claim that they've touched it, but none more so than I think the three of you who are sitting to my right. Steve, I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit about your role. What were the conversations like that you were having with lawmakers, and how did you convince lawmakers on both sides of the aisle to buy in to this landmark piece of legislation?
Well, I think the context, is important here, which is at the time, unemployment was high. I think it was 9%, and then people were concerned about that. And the data was pretty compelling about the role new businesses, startup businesses played in job creation. And that we were able to communicate in terms of framing it, that it's not really a partisan issue in terms of trying to deal with unemployment. Everybody wants to create more jobs. Of course, big businesses are going to create jobs. Of course, small businesses are going to create jobs, but it seems like most of the jobs are created by new businesses. So I want to figure out better ways to get more new businesses started, including some of the crowdfunding provisions, and also better ways to take some of those growing companies and allow them to go public so they can continue to kind of grow and create even more jobs. That part was, I think, relatively easy. Just to there was a lot of kind of agreement on that. Where the real challenge was, not surprisingly, was not so much deciding what to do, it was more figuring out how to build the bridges to get it done. And that just required a lot of, kind of conversation with a lot of people, and trying to, even though the tendency, and sadly, right now it's the case here as well, of everything is super partisan, and there isn't, the ability to kind of come together and figure out what really is in the country's interest and compromise on some things to get to there. There was a moment where we were able to thread the needle, and that was partly because there were a lot of work, as you've heard, the task force, some of the work of the Jobs Council, some of the work of the Small Business Administration, which started focusing also on startups, some of the work of the SEC, and when I was asked to co-chair this initiative around, or chair that startup initiative as part of the Jobs Council, we said, we don't need to come up with any new ideas. There are plenty of ideas out there. We actually got McKinsey pro bono to collect all the ideas related to this that have been proposed in the previous 10 years, and we kind of prioritize them based on which would likely have the most impact in terms of job creation. That was sort of the framing of that report, that then connected with a lot of other things other people were proposing. And that was just kind of going back and forth. Turned out it was helpful. I think that the Jobs Council was something that President Obama was really focused on. Valerie Jarrett was spending a lot of time on. Really empowered that group to try to move some things forward. So when we came up with our recommendations, even though there's some things that were uncomfortable to Democrats, some things that were uncomfortable to Republicans, there was some momentum and support from the White House, which certainly helped. And also, there was a lot of support in the House and the Senate on the Republican side. I remember even calling Eric Cantor, I think the night before the Jobs Council released its report, and said, there's some things in this report that might surprise you, and I think you might like. So when it comes out, I encourage you and your staff to read it and understand what's in there. And he did read it, called back next day and said, there's a bunch of things we can work together on. And that kind of led to, I think he gets credit, you would know better, but for even the framing of the calling of the Jobs Act, which turned out to be a creative and useful kind of framing of it as well. So it was just a moment where people were very concerned about unemployment. There was a broader national concern that it was truly bipartisan, really nonpartisan. How do we get this moving? And there were enough ideas on all sides that people said, well, let's cobble something together and let's see if we can get it done. That said, most of the people I talked to at the time did say, you're kind of wasting your time on this. There is zero chance of getting legislation passed in an election year. And one thing you don't tell an entrepreneur is there's zero chance. And it's like, well, now I got to take a shot at it. And thankfully, a lot of people really rallied to support it.
And sorry to chime in here, but Steve is actually being very humble. He was the only person in Washington who could personally speak to President Obama and Majority Leader Eric Cantor and was on good terms with both. Perhaps the only person in the world who could go back between Republicans and Democrats without an assumption that he's a Democrat or Republican in a time where I think it maybe feels about the same here in Washington. But Steve was one of the few people who could do that, and he actively did it to the point where he was ubiquitous in all these movements, both with the White House and especially in the House.
That's fantastic. Kudos, because I think it goes to the importance of this area. And capital raising is not by itself a partisan issue. We just have a knack for making things partisan. But there is no one who could ever get elected campaigning against entrepreneurship or saying anything that would remotely imply you don't support companies growing and scaling. It gets into the mechanics. Rodney, I want to hear your perspective. What compelled you to jump in? You gave a little bit of that background, the Tea Party and the Coffee Party jumping in, but you really saw the potential, particularly with online capital raising, to empower communities that didn't have as deep of pockets. Tell us a little bit more about that, and what was your role behind the scenes?
Well, I thought it was quite brilliant that there was, really this proposed mechanism that could unlock capital that existed in places where the capital holders didn't even know that they could participate in said opportunity. And so just kind of looking at the lay of the land and understanding kind of the partisanship that was happening, I was like, you're going to have to get the Congressional Black Caucus involved, and you're going to have to tell a story around that. And so I remember having this conversation with Congresswoman Maxine Waters at the time, and I was keynoting this Association of National Minority Bankers Associations. These are the owners of Black banks and Hispanic banks in the country. And afterwards, I was having a conversation about, and I always start with storytelling, right? I was first Black co-founder of a tech company to raise over $1 million in the South. Only 3 of us at the time. One of them you invested in, Omar, with Black Planet. Mine was multicast. We were pioneers in streaming. And then there was Clarence Wooten, who's now at Alphabet, and built a company, raised capital in 2000, sold it in 2010 for 8 figures. So, you sell a company, your bishop or pastor gives you a call. Every politician, somehow you end up on their database. And so I said, well, how am I going to leverage this new influence? And I said, well, right now we're dealing with what I call outliers in this space as it relates to those who look like me that raise millions in venture capital. How do we normalize that? And I said, then if we take that and we compare it to what churches in America, particularly the Black church, do every Sunday, and they raise offerings and they raise tithes. So the concept of crowdfunding, I basically just juxtaposed it to something that we already do, and then basically told a story like, what if there were tens of thousands of us that ultimately would be in a place to fund HBCUs and fund minority serving institutions and build family life centers and keep you in office? And so just telling that conversation over and over again, and I'll tell you, I didn't have to keep meeting with Black legislators at the Congressional Black Caucus. They got it because the concept of access to capital and not having access to that capital was not a foreign mission, right? They knew what the data said, and they knew that we had to unlock capital, but everything they've been seeing was just basically the same old same. And I'm like, well, this is something new. It's not going to be a panacea, right? It's not going to be a silver bullet. Let's just give it a try. And I think that's sort of how we were able to get folks on the other side of the aisle. Look, I'm clearly a Democrat. Folks know that. And I've always been outspoken about sometimes the party that I vote and how we look at capital markets and how we look at unlocking entrepreneurialism. And that's kind of where I put my foot in the sand and said, if you really want to see everyone experience this American construct and American dream, we got to get some innovation in the capital markets. And the Jobs Act was the first step to get us there.
Fantastic. So along that same line of storytelling and helping to communicate, you were telling your personal story and the story of communities across the country. Kevin, you organized a letter that had more signatories. I think that the letter had to have more pages of signatories than possibly the content of the letter, but in support of the Jobs Act. I mean, I think it had over 500 investors, 18 incubators, 2,700 entrepreneurs, and 1,500 startup community supporters. So kudos to you for wrangling that list. But what was it like to convene that many people who were speaking from a common voice and being the person that helped communicate that to those on the Hill?
Yeah, that was an interesting weekend. That was the main thing. We'd, at the time, a little context would help because what was happening with startups is because starting a startup became cheaper, there were many, many more founders than there used to be. And there were the same number of people funding those founders. So the idea of reaching out to investors using Twitter or the demo days or a platform like AngelList, that was kind of how people naturally gravitated. And we started to be told by the lawyers, wait a minute, this might not be legal. And we're like, that can't be right. We're just automating and doing what the way fundings happen anyway. Followed about a week later by letters from SEC enforcement saying, hey, could you come talk to us and tell us why what you're doing is not illegal? At the time, we weren't charging anything, so it ended up okay for us. But we realized we weren't the only ones. All the founders were facing this across the country. And that's the context that they were facing as they started to realize, wait a minute, this could get in our way for what we're trying to do. So that's what we stepped into when we started to get involved and the mood of the entrepreneurs already. The specific thing you're talking about was when the Jobs Act had passed the House and was going into the Senate, it came up for vote a lot sooner than anybody expected it to. And when it came up for vote, it was like, okay, this is going to be iffy. I don't know if it's going to pass the Senate. And so we started asking, well, what would make it pass the Senate? And we're like, well, if there were a grassroots thing where people across the country really cared, but, it's the Jobs Act, it's about finance. I don't know if that's going to happen. And we had the same reaction Steve did. Well, you can't tell us this can't happen. So that was Friday. So we're like, okay. So we put together the letter and we put it online with kind of the way most people would think about these days, but it was a little new then. Great. When you sign, it automatically prompts you to tweet and say, I signed this. You should take a look and sign. And of course, that was it was all entrepreneurs that started it. Steve signed on and started it early. Naval, the founder of AngelList, sent it to his followers, and it just kind of spread. So by Saturday, we were launched and kind of underway. By Sunday, we had all the signatures, and Monday morning, we delivered it. But we had to use tech for that too. We were like, okay, so for each senator's office that got it, it was a link specific to them that pulled out the signatories from their state and moved them right to the top, so that everybody from their state would show up there. And all 50 states had signatories. So there was somebody from every state. And of course, it was concentrated around the tech states. And those were the senators who were really strongly in support of it when it came to the vote. So it was an interesting time. But I think if we'd had more experience in Washington, we might not have kind of dived down for all the reasons you were saying. People are like, oh, this is okay. If you're getting involved now, it's going to be 5 years before anything happens.
Well, that's a fantastic story, and it goes to the power of advocacy and not being willing to take the no, that's not going to change for an answer, but saying, but maybe what if it could, and figuring out how to build coalitions. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to fast forward through the portion where we actually get the Jobs Act into law. We have the different titles. We've got Title I that makes a number of changes for emerging growth companies and scaling disclosure obligations, which, as we've heard, Joel was very involved in. We've got Titles 2 through 4 that made big changes to private markets, not just including Title 3 and crowdfunding, but also changing Reg A, making it into what people began calling Reg A plus, and allowing much more capital to be raised that way, as well as allowing online offerings using general solicitation. And if I am already boring you with that, I promise I won't speak in regulatory citations with all of them. There are plenty of numbers and letters that I could also throw into the mix. But wonderful changes that were put into effect, many of which were self-executing, but a lot of them required the SEC to take action. What I'd like to do is to fast forward looking at the impact. So this is where we do the final bits of the retrospective before we dive into the what's next. Looking at the impact of Title I and the impact on public markets, depending on how you look at the data set, around 90% of the companies that have gone public since the Jobs Act have done so using some of the EGC accommodations as emerging growth companies. And if you looked at the numbers from last year, I don't think we can claim necessarily the Jobs Act was the impetus, but last year was the most momentous year for public market entrants that we have seen in a decade at least. Would love to get perspective, Joel, from you on how soon, as a lawyer in private practice, once you stopped drafting Title I and you went back to the billable hours, how soon did companies begin taking advantage of this new EGC status? What was it like to see that uptick?
Well, it was 10 years ago today when President Obama signed the Jobs Act into law. Steve was standing on the dais right behind the president. I was a little farther away, but it was a beautiful day in the Rose Garden. And at that moment, as soon as before the ink was dry on the bill, I sent an email to some colleagues, and the first 2 confidential submissions to the SEC went in at that moment. And that was the magic of, we'll talk about it a little later, about Title I and self-executing. So it did not require SEC rulemaking. It automatically changed the relevant provisions of the Securities Act. And so we were able to use it immediately, and we did.
Commissioner Peirce, you are always ready with a fantastic analogy. It's the trademark of your speeches, and I love how we talk about the on-ramp with IPOs, because it implies to me like you're traveling down the local road and you see the on-ramp where you could all of a sudden start going a lot faster on the interstate. And it's your choice of whether or not you decide to go take that ramp or not. Would love to hear your perspective about the need for meaningful choices so that companies could opt in and say, look, this looks really attractive for me to become a public company. This is a meaningful pathway versus this is a detour that, by golly, I really wish there weren't cones telling me that I needed to reroute. Would just love to hear some of your perspective on that front.
Sure. I mean, I think one of the things that I've learned is there is a balance, right? We have a really complex framework in the United States, and there are a lot of different options and different roads that you can take. And in one way that's bad because it is so complicated. So kudos to your office for trying to put some clarity around that by putting out some really easy to follow guidance that you can walk through on our website now. So I think that's a tool that people will use. But at the end of the day, we're better off at having a lot of different options, different ones that will work for different companies at different stages of their lives. And so I'd like us to continue to explore some ways that we can add to those options. And, you know, each company really is unique. And it's not only the company, but it's the community in which the company operates, right? So we have the Silicon Valley model, but a lot of companies are not in Silicon Valley. So we need to have options that are going to work outside of that environment. You know, as Rodney mentioned, we've got to figure out ways to unlock capital. I like to say that one of the reasons I came to the SEC is because I believe in the power of our capital markets to transform people's lives in ways that, you know, nothing else really can, right? But it will only work if we can make sure that investors, more of the population is participating as investors, but also more of the population is looking to capital markets to say, I can go build my business by drawing on the capital in those capital markets. And so I think what the Jobs Act did and what we can continue doing by expanding our options is to make sure that there are options that work for everyone at every stage of their lives.
Well, speaking of options for those that are outside of Silicon Valley, let's talk about biotech companies based out of Gaithersburg, Maryland. Jonathan, talk to us a little bit about your experience, because you were able to actually take the things that went into place with the exempt offering changes using crowdfunding and Reg A to raise capital that you might not have otherwise had access to. How did the ability to raise capital online and not go the traditional, whether we call it the Silicon Valley route or the Boston biotech route, how did that transform your company?
Yeah, so it was very transformative. So over the years, I've raised capital from almost every source, under Reg D, other than traditional Silicon Valley venture capital. So they've raised money from angels, angel clubs, family offices, corporate strategics. From my experience, by far, raising capital under Reg CF and Reg A is the best way for an entrepreneur to raise capital for two important reasons. One, it is the least taxing on the time of the CEO. So from my experience, if you talk to other CEOs of companies, public and private, very often they have to devote about 50% of their time to raising capital, to road shows, meeting with groups, cajoling, answering questions over and over the same ones again. But with equity crowdfunding, you're basically raising capital in your pajamas, as I said. So there's a lot of front-end work, to be sure, but a lot of that work can be done by people other than the CEO. And that's not true of traditional fundraising. It's really just the CEO, maybe the CFO in some cases can help, but the marketing, if you have some good marketing people, they can do a lot of creating the landing pages and the digital marketing. Your accounting people can do a lot of the compliance work. So I might spend, once we get a campaign underway, 10% of my time or less. So it allows you to focus on building your business. And that's what we should be doing. So as I mentioned, we pivoted in a big way at the start of the pandemic. We were one of the first companies to bring in, actually remember, rapid antigen tests. There was a period of time we had no tests in the United States. We were one of the first companies to bring tests in the United States, validate them, and put them out. And we had the capital because we had been doing crowdfunding. So we had the capital then to equip our lab to do the PCR. And we're doing very high volumes for our state and for our county. None of this I don't think we could have done if there wasn't equity crowdfunding. I mean, you can't go to angel meetings when you have a pandemic and so on. So for us, it worked great. But there's one other very important aspect of this type of Reg A and Reg CF that I think is actually good for the entrepreneurs. And it may sound counterintuitive, but that it imposes a certain amount of regulatory discipline. And it forces you to be very careful with what you say to investors. Now, I'd like to believe that I've always been careful, but when you have the SEC looking at it, you have FINRA looking at it, you have your portal, which are broker dealers looking at it, you have your PCAOB auditors. It forces you to be very careful when you issue a press release, when you do a PowerPoint. And this actually came up early in the pandemic, since we were one of the first companies to come out with a press release about COVID testing. The SEC Enforcement Division did a blanket probe on companies, and we were one of them. And they knocked on our door, and they did a probe, and we supplied them with everything they asked for to support the claims we had made in a press release, and we came away unscathed. So I think that discipline, that culture that it builds in companies, in young companies, is good for the company, it's good for their shareholders, and it's good for the public at large.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. So Kevin, I want to switch. We'll go to the opposite end of the table. And I should say, by the way, if you have additional thoughts that you want to weigh in with to any of our panelists, please feel free to do so. This does not need to be just me directing traffic today. But Kevin, I want to hear from your perspective. A lot of angel investing was done via private offerings, and there was no such thing as being able to talk about it online. AngelList was able to harness that, as well as some of the future iterations of what came out of it. How transformative was that change to be able to not just talk about the product you might be building or the service, but the investment opportunity in your company online to reach investors?
So that changed quite a bit pretty quickly. There was a section in Title II of the Jobs Act that laid out what a platform could do without crossing into having to register with FINRA as a broker-dealer. And that section allowed a lot of this activity to move online. And there, at first, it was a little slow. People were just using it the same as they would offline. But pretty quickly, that ramped up, and it changed two things. One, which is kind of interesting, is if you think about venture, the people who are doing investing and even angel investing, they've had a big successful company. You know, you didn't do it until you had an exit yourself. You weren't writing checks into other companies. And so venture looked like what the founder community looked like 20 to 30 years ago. As that changed and people could get involved at smaller amounts sooner, the community doing the investing changed faster. It looks like the founder community did 5 years ago or 10 years ago, which accelerated both where this was happening and who was doing it, right? So we started pulling some statistics for this, and I was actually surprised by the results. I had not looked at the statistics recently, but at this point, over half of the dollars that flowed through AngelList last year, so last year was about 6,000 companies and about $2 billion flowing into them. Over half of that was outside the major tech hubs, outside of New York, San Francisco. And the percentage of founding teams that had a female or minority founder went from a abysmally low 12% to probably still too low, but better, 35%. That is a significant change. And that's because who was doing the investing? You know, it's a maxim of startup investing. You invest in who you know and what you know. And because people were investing in their networks and that was spreading, that changed the dynamic for who was receiving the money. So a lot of this reduction of friction made everything move faster, including the changes in where and who was doing the investing. So it was a really fascinating side effect that I would not have predicted when it happened.
Well, it's a great point you make, and we've got, for those who are in the room, we have copies of our office's annual report that are on some of the tables, and I see that Rodney's got his in front of him, which I know he's seen before because I spam him with all of my emails whenever we've got something new. But you're really talking, Kevin, about the concept of homophily and pattern matching, things that we know to be true about human behavior. And if we want to see changes, and it's something that you see in a report, if you want to see changes in who gets funded, we have to also look at who the funders and the investors are and make sure that people are equipped to back people that they resonate with. There's nothing necessarily wrong with wanting to invest in people who seem familiar with you, but it is really important that we equip people with the tools to be able to do so that may not look like the traditional investor. I would love, Rodney, to hear your perspective because you've been really involved here. How have you seen crowdfunding in particular unlock potential with a lot of the entrepreneurs that you have been working with over the last decade? And has that made changes in communities that might not have had as many investors that were from angel investor or venture capital backgrounds?
Incredible question. There's a lot to unpack there. And it's sort of like what Steve was referencing earlier. You tell an entrepreneur no, they're just going to continue to push forward. And so from my context and experience, it's not that they're not, Black founders that are going out there pitching, but for whatever that reason is, you're not in my network, there's someone that can't quite vouch for you or what have you. You got on this, angel and VC to some extent, it's very relational, right? People are getting more comfortable with the person sometimes, before they do the idea or the product or what have you. And so when you're kind of up against that context, you got to kind of like find the alternative. And, going back, I remember kind of like the purgatory years between, the promises of Regulation 3, the Reg CF, Title 3 and Reg CF coming. And there were a lot of portals that kind of fell by the wayside waiting for that to come to fruition, right? A lot of people invested a lot of money. And so there were folks that were sort of doing these hybrid deals of I raised some angel, and then on the same terms, I kind of go to like a seed investor, something like that, or an angel list where I kind of do something on the same terms. And so we saw kind of like this nascent adoption, right? Now, 2020 hit, and of course, we saw the murders of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and others, and it unlocks something in this country, not just as it relates to inequities in criminal justice, but also the direct correlation of economic opportunities. And so a lot of folks are like, well, we hadn't done enough, right? Or we need to do more. I mean, we got together and, invested $2 million, thanks to Steve and others out there in the market in 2020. But we saw some incredible traction around Reg CF in 2020 because it sent two signals that there were people outside of the network of Black founders that could get into the network, right? The network works both ways. I may not be in your network, but that means you're not in my network. So we saw for both of that, then we get a connection. But I also saw, you kind of got folks like, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so they were like, well, we're going to do it ourselves. We're not going to wait for venture to figure out that they have challenges in investing equitably. We're just going to start investing. And we saw so much deal flow. I think about Flukas Ventures, which is one of the largest syndicates on Angel List. She started a year and a half ago, and has raised over $50 million through the platform, getting money to, what I call undertapped founders. We saw, Streamalytics, this sort of kind of engine around data and analytics and how people can protect their data. We made the first $2,500, investment in their Reg CF. Then we did a webinar. They closed the round in 3 days, right? Some of us who have experience in raising venture know we don't close rounds in 3 days. And so the automation of the process, the transparency of the round, we saw a lot happen between 20 and 22. And now you have, again, I'm speaking for founders that are in my ecosystem. They are saying, well, we're going to try something different. And then really quickly, when you look at, Black people with money, y'all know there are some Black people with money, right? So, yes. Y'all lighten up a little bit.
I'm with you on the jokes. I know I've got my mic on.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So really quickly, we noticed that there were more people that were interested in getting in the asset class, that had good paying jobs, not just athletes and entertainers, but folks, college degrees, master's degrees, and they were working and they had discretionary capital. And so they were looking at, how do we become this new emerging class of angel investors and limited partners? We just graduated a class of 46, mostly Black students, Black learners, all accredited per current SEC definitions, that went through our class at UNC, Duke, and Stanford. So there is a demand, and this was done in partnership with the Links, right? So this is a group of 17,000 affluent Black women in America that were looking for investment opportunities, but wanted to close that gap. And so I think we're just at the beginning, but the bones are there. And something happened in 2020. We all know what it was, but we need to maintain that momentum so that we could get closer to parity in this country.
And I think that that's the perfect note to end on as we're looking at the impact of the Jobs Act, and a perfect moment for us to look at, okay, what could come next? So what I'd love to do is look ahead at how do we build on this, and where are there areas where each of you bring your unique perspective and see, okay, if I'm thinking about what would have the most impact in future, whether it is policymaking, whether you're hoping the SEC does something on it, whether you're hoping that Congress takes action, where are changes needed that can ultimately carry forward with some of that momentum and create momentum in new spaces where it's been missing. I'd love to start with, because we've got, Title I is where we started. We were talking about impact. Joel, I would love for you to start and talk a little bit about your perspective on the public markets and what further changes you think would likely have the greatest impact on companies' interest in going public, but not just, I don't want you to just, I'm going to get two-parter because you're a lawyer, so you're going to be great with this. The two-parter is not only companies' interest in going public, but also looking specifically at the challenges of smaller public companies who we have seen on the decline and much less likely to go public as a small public company than they were years ago. It's now we're seeing really large companies that are waiting until they're ready to go public. What changes do you think are needed for our public markets as we look ahead?
I'm going to tackle that two-part question by stepping back from before we get to what and just talk about how, because I think a lot of the success of Title I has to do with how we went about it, or how Congress went about it. But based on the task force recommendations, we pursued a particular approach. And first, it allowed us to strike a compromise, a balance between two different camps. There's, for understandable and legitimate reasons, I think there are two very different perspectives on whether current levels of regulation are optimal, super optimal, suboptimal. And you have the crowd, or you have the side that is aligned with always less regulation, and you have the other side that's aligned with always more regulation. What we did was we scaled the regulation. And so it strikes a balance between those two polar opposites. And I think it had a lot to do with the success of, with the near unanimous passage of certainly Title I, and maybe it helped on the other titles as well. And that's because the creation of the emerging growth company category created this vehicle for streamlining regulation for a limited period of time in a targeted way. And so scaling the regulatory burden so that the smaller companies face a lower burden and the larger companies eventually face that larger regulatory burden, and giving the smaller companies time to grow into that higher regulatory burden. We see it right now, there are major rulemakings and they're going to apply across the board. If you're an S&P 500 company, you blink and say, okay, my ESG compliance cost just doubled, no big deal. If you're a really small company, that's a very big deal. And so the EGC, the Emerging Growth Company category, created this vehicle allowing us to scale the regulation. The second thing is that by using that approach, the reforms applied to the whole IPO ecosystem. You said basically earlier 90%. At the time, people were crunching numbers and saying these reforms would apply to 97% of the IPO market. And so on one side, you had people pounding the table and rending their garments. This is going to apply to 97% of IPOs. That's crazy. And then I was on a panel with someone who said, that based on the category, it's going to apply to 97% of IPOs. Looks like you guys hit the nail on the head. So it certainly depends on your perspective, but the idea was to apply to the whole ecosystem. We didn't want to create a junior varsity kind of system. The SEC already, we borrowed a lot of concepts. There are, you have smaller reporting companies, you have all these, and in the old days, there was this an alternative form called the small business forms. Well, who wants to be a public company and report on SB? You want to report on the big boy, the big girl forms. And so we were very conscious of not creating a JV kind of system or where you would wear that scarlet letter. You want it to be a real IPO. So we felt strongly it needed to apply across the board. And that could happen by scaling the regulation in the way that I described. So it applied to 97 or 90+% of IPOs, but we made the point repeatedly that at the time was 3% of total market capitalization, a really small number when you're talking about the all public companies as a class. And then the last thing is that the third of these three things that I think were critical to the success of Title I. The changes were really focused, they were targeted, and they were simple. So it's a short number of pages. Title I doesn't take up a lot of room. It's all self-executing. It's these little tweaks in the statute, and we were focusing on how can we make a little change that'll have an outsized impact. And so we in the report, we collected those little changes and put them together, and we said, you give us these things, let us do testing the waters, change the communication restrictions in the act. Let us start the process confidentially. Foreign private issuers could already do that. So again, going back to our pitch, in the halls of Congress, we'd say Chinese companies are allowed to start their IPO confidentially, but if you're in Peoria, you cannot. How does that make any sense? And, people would get it immediately. And then the on-ramp, the scale disclosure, the relief from Sarbanes-Oxley Section 404B, the internal controls audit. You still have to comply with 404A, so you still have to have internal controls. You still have to certify as to them. And we also collected a long list of all the things that did not change. We weren't proposing to touch the liability provisions. So we had a long list of all of these very onerous things that all public companies, including EGCs, would have to do. And people say, oh, well, that seems quite sensible. You're really not doing crazy things here. So that had a lot to do with calming some of the more strident voices at the time, saying this would be a terrible thing. And then, again, I think it's already been mentioned, but it all happened through self-executing statutory text. So April 5th, President Obama signs the act into law, and we're off to the races. There were mandatory rulemakings. Some had 90-day periods that took more than a year before you saw final rules. Some had 270-day statutory rulemaking mandates that took 3+ years, as Kevin well knows. So I would say if you can do all of that, if we could do all of that again, if these planets could all align and we could have all of those things happen again, you'd have a similar kind of magic, and it would help the IPO. It would continue to help IPOs, and that would also help the smaller companies going public, because if you foster a better and more hospitable ecosystem, you're going to see the smaller companies benefit from it as well.
I think that's the message on simplicity is one that is not lost on me, because it is really, when you get into the complexity angle of how do you actually strike different balances, that is where things get bogged down. That's where you go from 90 days to a year, or 270 days to 270 pages plus an economic analysis that follows. The complexity piece is what will trip us up. And so I think that figuring out the simple solutions is a critical takeaway as we look ahead. And I love what you said about the importance of scaling. It makes me laugh. About the weekend before last, I took my toddler. This is a fun segue for each of you in the audience. Took my toddler to a playground and decided, I'll show you what the big kids play on, because he'd only ever been playing over in this other area. And I said, I'll show you this. Look, this is a seesaw. This is going to be so fun. So I put him on one side, and his very pregnant mother went and sat on the other side, and he went straight up in the air, not too fast. He didn't eject, but he just looked at me like, this is the worst game ever. This is not a game for me to play with you. And I looked at him and I thought, let's go back to the slide that's for people that are your size and scale. This is not the game you want to be playing today. And I think that same analogy of who are you? What is your scale and complexity? We hear from companies, whether it is, a biotech company like Jonathan's, who might have 50 employees, a relatively large market cap or valuation based on intellectual property, but not the complexity of operations. Figuring out how to right size that scale is hard, but I think it is really critical for making sure that ramp remains something that someone chooses to do and sees as a valuable pathway, not necessarily just looking at acquisition as the pathway to get some liquidity back for the founders and investors. Commissioner Peirce, I think you have a lot of thoughts as we talk about the 90 days to 1 year, 270-day rulemaking period, to many more. What role do you see the SEC having in supporting companies that are going public? Some of these things that you highlighted when we started could have been done by the SEC, but that weren't. The SEC will obviously be involved in any of these changes, particularly with public markets. What do you see as the role and what do you think is most important for us to keep in mind as we look ahead?
Yeah, I mean, self-executing is great if you can get it. Although it's sometimes hard to know in advance to work through all the details and figure out how this is going to play out. So you may decide you want the SEC to be involved in writing the rules. I mean, to defend the SEC, the time of the Jobs Act, there were still a lot of Dodd-Frank mandates that we were working through, and so there was a lot of work for one. But the other piece of it is that sometimes when the SEC gets a mandate from Congress to ease up on regulation or make it easier to do something, they say, well, let's balance that by putting some maybe additional requirements and so they sort of undermine what the purpose was. But we do have the ability to go back and see how things are working. So with crowdfunding, we had the opportunity during COVID. I mean, there was a lot of bad stuff happening, but it was also a time when we realized crowdfunding could be an effective tool. And so we were able to pull back some of the burdens from that temporarily and learn from that and see, oh, crowdfunding really does have the ability to be successful. And there are other areas where we can make a little tweak that makes a big difference. So Jonathan and I were talking about one suggestion that he had around, it was a Reg A, right, to use QR codes to allow people to access disclosure through a QR code. And that was something that I thought was a really fascinating idea and tried to float it back at the SEC, but the reaction is, no, because it's too hard, right? It's one extra step than you're supposed to have. And it's that kind of thinking that I think prevents us from hearing people say, I have a great way to make this type of fundraising more usable, and then we don't actually take the step to make that happen. So on the public company side, I think we need to be thinking about that. We just put out a proposal on SPACs. So that's another way for companies to get into the public markets. And it does seem, in my mind, designed to sort of shut down that avenue. So I think we just need to, keep an open mind to the fact that companies aren't all the same, that routes to going public aren't all the same, and that when you do get into the public markets, the burdens fall very differently on, as you mentioned, on small companies. So we have to take that into account. The more ways we can try to bear that in mind, scale obligations when we impose them, I think that can be helpful.
So what I'd like to do, and I think those are spot on remarks, Commissioner Peirce, what I'd like to do is when we're talking, so we're going to try to make up for lost time so that we don't go too far over our slated time. As we look at changes, not just to public markets, but also to things that have been talked about as potential changes in private markets and exempt offerings, whether that is changes to the accredited investor definition or further changes or enhancements to crowdfunding and the ability to raise capital online, or micro offerings, or equity compensation to gig employees. What I'd love to do, because I think each person has your own kind of lens and thoughts, and some of you spoken publicly about some of these issues, some of them this may be the first time that we hear your thoughts. Rather than me directing one specific issue set or set of potential private market reforms to any of you, I'd love to just start down at the end of the table. Maybe we can start with you, Kevin, and then go down of what do you think would be the most impactful as far as raising capital before a company is public, because the reality is there is no company that starts out as a public company, and we have to have the thriving and very fertile grounds in which smaller companies can grow, scale, and get ready to become a public company in order to see thriving public markets. So they're the size of, two different, well, we can use the seesaw analogy or two sides of the same coin, but it is critical that we think about both. So Kevin, we'll start with you and then head down the table.
Sure. There's a couple of things. If I think about what the Jobs Act did for most companies, is it enabled the companies to contact more of the investors that were already able to invest. What I would love to see now is I'd love to extend the number of investors that can reach these companies safely. There's still reasons to make sure that they are safe investments, but to extend the number of investors who can invest. Because, as I mentioned, investors invest in who they know and what they know. The more investors you have from more different backgrounds, the more kinds of companies and founders will get financed. And so I think that would be good. And that goes to, I think you already mentioned the accredited investor definition. We've had for a while that we still haven't seen come to fruition, this idea that sophisticated investors, even if they haven't met the wealth threshold, should be able to invest. I would also like to see unaccrediteds be able to get in through other mechanisms like funds to invest in startups, things like that, that could also still be safe, yet let a broader group of investors invest in these types of things. I think those are the main themes I'd love to see. There's a second bit that I'll touch on crowdfunding, and I'm sure you'll touch more on it, Rodney, given what you have been focused on earlier, of making some of the impacts on the companies and the portals for crowdfunding be more similar to the way the companies and portals work for non-crowdfunding, because it is still harder for a crowdfunded company. They have to still have audit requirements that non-crowdfunded companies don't, for example. Or this idea that if you stay small and just do crowdfunding, you'll eventually hit the limit of the number of investors. So if you could somehow exempt the crowdfunding investors from the investor limit cap, so that they can continue to use crowdfunding to raise if they're still small. And then the portal themselves, make them work similar, less liability and more ability to not exactly give advice, but at least help curate what goes on the platform so that you help investors who are new to it know what investments they should be taking a look at. So those are the areas I'd love to see a new Jobs Act start to focus on. Rodney?
Sure. I will blur through these and happy to double click offline. We got to fund Title VII of the Jobs Act. There has to be funding for outreach. And I think if more people know about the Jobs Act, where's the Super Bowl commercial about this American innovation? We saw more crypto, ads on the last Super Bowl. And so I think there are incredible opportunities there. Create a portal light application for ecosystem building organizations and the groups that are helping to develop startups on a day-to-day basis. There's still pattern matching and other known and unknown bias that's happening even at the selection level of portals. And so I think if we get more folks with more portals, we'll also increase the amount of deal flow as well. I do think we need to update the accredited investor definition to include approved certificates from accredited colleges and universities. There are programs that have been teaching folks how to invest in this asset class, and I think that should be a criteria also for becoming accredited and as well. And whatever you do, please do not increase the threshold. Some of us are barely accredited, and if we're not in the game, it's going to cut out a whole lot of capital that's sort of on the margins. So here to that. I think GPs, those of us that have small funds, that 99 rule can hurt us. If you look at the median wealth of Black and brown families and those who actually, pull themselves up by their bootstraps and make it, but still aren't able to invest because I can only have 99 limited partners that are accredited. So that means my fund is always going to be a certain size if I'm raising capital out of my respective network as well. And then I think finally, this should resonate with a lot of folks. Let's reduce capital gains taxes for investors who invest specifically in startups and funds founded by founders who align with the legal archetypal definitions for the Treasury Department's Minority Business Development Agency. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodney. Steve?
All right. Well, I'm going to take a step back. I think there are a lot of specific things, and you've heard some, and there's the report that was passed around has more, and I agree with most of those things. But I think that my lesson learned from 10 years ago was you got to get the framing right, and you got to get the relationship building right. Otherwise, it's just ideas on a piece of paper. On the framing, I talked about 10 years ago, was animated by a concern around unemployment and the need to focus on job creation and the recognition, which took a while, but the recognition that these new businesses, startups for the big job creators. Now I think there's three themes that kind of could drive something forward. One is remaining the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in the world, in a world that's becoming increasingly competitive and greater global competitive threats, particularly around China, which is why some of the legislation recently has become the China bill. That's sort of partly a fear that America will lose its edge, and partly a fear that China will win the next battle, which is certainly possible. That's an important part of the framing. The second is creating a more inclusive innovation economy. So it's not just a few people in a few places that are benefiting, and a lot of other people in a lot of other places feeling left behind and kind of angry about it. And that obviously kind of implicates a lot of our politics. So how do you get more entrepreneurs in more places, not just in Silicon Valley or New York, but all across the country, to give them a shot at the American dream and a shot at creating jobs in their communities, to give those communities more kind of hope and a sense of opportunity. I think that is a critical theme. And the third, which is one that also was part of what drove the Jobs Act 10 years ago, was getting people on both sides of the aisle in what is continuing to be a sadly very hyper-partisan environment to realize it actually is important every once in a while to demonstrate that democracy works and that people can come together and get something done. And to me, those are the three kind of macro themes. How do we remain competitive in what is becoming a much more competitive global world? How do we become much more inclusive and really kind of have everybody everywhere have a shot if they want to be an entrepreneur, they want to be an investor, not just a few people in different places. That's important politically because still to this day, the venture capital dollars overwhelmingly go to a few states. 75% of the dollars go to 3 states. The other 47 states fight over 25%. So most of the country and most of the members of Congress representing most of those parts of those country, their entrepreneurs in their communities are essentially disadvantaged, and they shouldn't allow that to happen. So that's the framing side of things. And again, the specifics matter, but I think getting the framing right is critically important. And then the other piece is bridge building, relationship building, trust building. I'm frustrated that a lot of these ideas have been percolating for a few years. There's legislation, Endless Frontiers, and the Competes Act, and USICA, and so forth. And it's sort of these, factions on both sides got to have their, kind of preferences. But there is not this, sense that this is now a time to come together. I think we have to. These things are now moving into conference. It'd be a tragedy if the parties on both sides, again, equal blame on both sides. When I'm talking to Republicans, they think it's all the Democrats' fault. When I'm talking to Democrats, I think it's all the Republicans' fault. I think it's everybody's fault. And I think we need to figure out a way to kind of find that moment again, thread the needle again, to pass some legislation that does, in fact, move us forward on a variety of these different fronts.
Fantastic, Steve. Thank you. Commissioner Peirce?
I think the micro ideas are great. The framing is great to think about too. I think part of it is telling stories that people can understand. I'm reading right now Phil Knight's book about how he started Nike, and what's striking in reading that book is how much you feel the stress of him not having access to capital at a time when his business was growing, and there was no shortage on the demand side. It was just not being able to get capital and just casting about to find anywhere you could get capital. And I think it's important for people to hear those kinds of stories. On the accredited investor front, I will just point out that under Chair Clayton, we did open the door to the possibility of other kinds of sophistication being taken into account. I think it's investor credentials at sec.gov. You can submit your ideas. So the credentialed institutions, I think that's a great idea. And I wish someone would walk through that door of providing another avenue, because I do fear that the thresholds may change. And then I'm always an advocate for a micro offering exemption, very streamlined, $250,000 to $500,000. Just to let people raise capital without a lot of headaches.
Joel?
Well, I'll pick up where you just left off on the micro exemption. It strikes me that one thing about Title III and crowdfunding is that it fosters this small deal ecosystem, but a lot of what it sort of does with an overlay of what of many features that you see in large deals. And one question would be whether you could come up with a micro deal kind of an exemption that is based strictly on a maximum dollar amount invested. By, if you're not accredited, then you can only invest X dollars, and debate where X should be, but there should be a limit where anybody can invest up to X, and then accredited investors can invest more. And if you, again, my hallmark when I try to come to this with ideas is simplicity, ultra simplicity, because there are ways of achieving a good balance between capital formation and market efficiency and investor protection without compromising among the three. And I think a lot of times simplicity is the key. That's not really my area, but that's sort of a comment from the peanut gallery. But back onto the in the IPO and public company arena, I read Representative McHenry's report that was released today. I love the ideas in it. I think in particular, it's got a number of really attractive ideas. Pages 31 to 35, I think, are well worth reading, and extending the IPO on-ramp, expanding well-known seasoned issuer or WICSI eligibility, a number of new accommodations that are summarized in that report, I think are really good stuff. And that would be my recommendation. And I'll just offer one little observation that we saw over the last 10 years. There were, despite the near unanimous passage of the Jobs Act, there's a fair amount of naysaying at the time. Because I guess that's what makes for a good news story is, oh my goodness, can you believe Congress just did this? And there were no shortage of pundits saying crazy things about what would happen as a result of these changes. Well, none of the crazy things happened. In fact, what the SEC did in the aftermath was they saw how balanced the changes were, and they said, you know what, we're going to extend confidential IPO review to all companies because that works exceedingly well. It removes a powerful disincentive to going public because you got to put it all out there 6 to 9 months before you know if it's even happening. And you know what, we're going to allow all companies to engage in testing the waters, and we're going to track exactly what Congress adopted in the change to the Securities Act. And I read with a broad smile the adopting release for that rule, because over and over, people were saying, shouldn't we add this protection or this additional requirement? And the SEC said, no, we really like what Congress did. It works really well. And we've got years of experience now, and we want to do that for everybody. So I would favor, I think it's time to turn that dial a little more and to expand the category and allow a greater amount of relief for IPO companies.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Yeah, so despite my enthusiasm for equity crowdfunding, I believe it is actually on borrowed time. And I say that because while the Jobs Act made it easier for ordinary Americans to buy shares of pre-IPO companies, it did not make it create a way for them to sell those shares. And the overwhelming majority of companies that have raised capital through Reg A and Reg C probably are not going to be good candidates for NASDAQ, New York Stock Exchange, and probably won't be acquired by a Fortune 100 company for 20 times, 30 times their market cap at the time they raising capital. So what's going to happen in probably 2 years or 3 years, we're going to run out of investors that people can only put so much capital in if they don't begin to see a return, and they don't hear about other people, friends and family that got a return. So what we need are good secondary trading opportunities specifically for Reg A and Reg CF. Now, Start Engine recently, last year or two, started Start Engine Secondary exactly for that purpose. Perhaps one of the first secondary trading platforms specifically for these types of companies. And we were one of the earlier companies. We threw our hat in the ring because I believe very much in this approach. So last year we were on Start Engine Primary. We did a crowdfunding round. We were probably getting 20 to 25 people a day were buying shares in our company. Weeks later, we transitioned to Start Engine Secondary, and we barely got 2 or 3 buyers a week. And there just was no liquidity. It didn't work. Now, what changed? They could no longer communicate with their vast list of 300,000, 400,000 subscribers about our company and our offering. The most important tool to market in equity crowdfunding by far is email lists, from my experience. Much more important than Facebook or Google. And they couldn't do it because of FINRA rules. Perhaps there was some SEC. I'll leave that to the securities lawyers here. That has to be fixed. It doesn't seem like it should be that big a problem. We need to allow the platforms to be able to market secondary offerings with the same vigor and effectiveness that they can offer primary. And I think once there's a robust secondary market where people can actually make money a year or two from making their investment, and then they tell their friends about it, then you're going to have, then you'll have the growth will be explosive, and that's what we need.
Thank you very much. I'm going to wrap things up for us. You all got a bonus 20 minutes from this esteemed panel that were saying too many wonderful things for me to cut off. But in wrapping up, before I turn it over to Ranking Member McHenry, I just wanted to reiterate 5 themes that I felt like I heard throughout today as we look ahead. The first was simplicity and the importance of any path forward being grounded in simplicity of approach. The second is relationships. We heard a lot about the importance of relationships in getting things done and in seeing things through. Inclusion and the importance of inclusion as a theme for future iterations of changes. Bipartisanship, there's no way that this moves without coalition building. And the last thing is people. It's what people resonated with the Jobs Act. It came back to people. Jobs was in the title. It was about human beings, not just companies and capital markets. But we've touched a lot on the importance of people there. So I want to thank you for the invitation to be your moderator today, and I will turn it over to you for closing remarks.
Well, Martha, thank you so much. I very much appreciate you hosting, and I think the panel did a wonderful job outlining the history, the benefits, and the opportunities ahead. What I didn't say and didn't participate in is I authored the section on crowdfunding, which was originally 3 pages of legislative text, and through compromise in the House, it ended up being 12. Which the SEC so kindly turned into 683 pages of regulation. And despite that, I still have a lot of respect for the venerable Securities and Exchange Commission. Not perfectly, but Esther, certainly you. But having said that, watching the Jobs Act and seeing the data, and if you commend to you the report that Financial Services Committee Republicans put together on what has occurred as a result of the Jobs Act. It's a fantastic success story by and large, my provision notwithstanding. But the additional thing I would add is, we cannot ignore the fact that we've experienced a change in the labor market over the last 2 years that would take a generation otherwise. People are making a decision about where they work and how they work. We have a changing labor market that we've never experienced in our lifetimes. And we have an economic circumstance that is not no recent example is applicable. So Steve talked about the moment in time of a stubbornly high unemployment and searching, equal size, Republicans and Democrats searching for a solution. We heard from Rodney the drive for the very same type of economic outcomes that Republicans speak of, Democrats speak of too. And sometimes we lose sight of that. And economic inclusion is about getting better economic performance overall. Everyone benefits when you get talent wherever they are. And so you want to widen the opportunities of where you can see investment capital. And then what Kevin outlined is a technology-enabled opportunity to bring investment opportunities to a wider array of folks. And it's a fantastic example. But now we see likewise that gig workers are trying to seek the same type of benefits and opportunities that career folks and companies get. So we need to look at the ways that somebody who's doing a DoorDash delivery can get the same type of compensation and equity benefits that somebody who's at DoorDash corporate. So I think there are a number of ideas in this space that are different than where they were because we're seeing a different jobs market and a different way that people want to work. And so it's the Financial Services Committee in the House that is the incubator of these ideas. Just like with the Jobs Act, we took great work from what Steve was doing, what Joel, what you and Kate were doing, and this type of thing that was cooking around DC. Out of the House, you can nimbly produce a lot of legislation. We think it's all great, but it's a lot of legislation. So we know it's not all perfect. And so we want to look at a number of different ways that we can expand opportunities, just as Rodney outlined on the accredited investor statute, a rule. And as Hester mentioned, the opening for us for the Securities Exchange Commission to address this. Joel competently talks about the opportunities in the public markets, and Jonathan has given us a lived example of the opportunities and challenges he's experienced that take the data off of the report and bring it to the story that Hester said we need to make sure we're mindful of. And so I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be to remember what is important about the Jobs Act, but not as a remembrance ceremony. But as I said at the beginning, what is passed is prologue. We see a divided government and an opportunity to legislate to solve a problem. A real problem in the workforce, a real problem in the economy. We have a new set of economic circumstances. We might find ourselves in a similarly divided government in a very short period of time. If that is the case, we hope that this conversation will be the driving force of how people think through these problems and seek solutions to benefit the people that elected us. So, Steve, thank you. Rodney, Kevin, thank you. Hester, thank you. Joel and Jonathan. Jonathan had the one of the shorter commutes, or Joel or Hester. Kevin had the longest. So, thank you for being here. And Martha, thanks for what you do on a daily basis for small businesses across the country and how well you handled a big and complex set of issues. So with that, thank you all for being here today. Look forward to seeing you soon.